This is the great outdoors. It is the place where bugs live and also the place where Cape Townians go to do drugs. It's so nice to walk and cycle and run through these kinds of areas. But what if you wanted to drive? Well, there are a bunch of cars to choose from with an incredible range of off-roading abilities, which you'll use twice a year. But what if you look at a Land Cruiser or a Land Rover Defender and you think, I want this, but can it be worse? Well, South Africa has the answer for you, because in the 1970s, we built a car, an off-roader that was designed to challenge the king of the hill, but somehow dismally failed. A car so fundamentally flawed that it only survived about 5 years of production before it got cancelled, but is so strange that I can't help but want to drive one. This is the story of one of the worst cars South Africa has ever produced. This is the story of the Chevrolet Nomad. Our story begins in the bad old days of apartheid South Africa. By this time, the racist fascist government had really stepped up their levels of evil, and the world started to react with economic sanctions. This terrified the Nationalist Party, and they started pushing for more products to be produced locally to sidestep these sanctions. All local companies were affected by this plan, including General Motors South Africa. GM had actually been in South Africa since the 1920s and had produced some incredible South African specific cars, like the Bakchit Can-Am and the Everyman Ranger. No, the Ranger, not that Ranger. Unfortunately for GM South Africa, by the late 60s and early 70s, their sales were starting to be eaten by the Japanese Revolution, with cars that were small, cheap, and economical to run. So GM South Africa decided that they needed a sales win. So they were going to do a ground up design and produce it in South Africa to align with the wishes of the NP. And what cars do South Africans love more than anything? Off-roaders. Filling this bushwhacking obsession since 1950 had been the first few generations of Land Rover. They were rugged, dependable, capable, and most of all, European, which most white South Africans wanted to be at the time. Some buyers optioned for the Japanese Land Cruiser, but the Land Rover was the OG. If you were a farmer, police officer, or weekend warrior, this was your car. So GM decided to go toe-to-toe with Land Rover, but use a concept that had been developed by the GM American mothership. Because you see, in 1972, GM had created a concept called the BTV, or the Basic Transport Vehicle. It was designed to be ultra basic, cheap, and dependable for third world markets, mainly aiming to be great delivery cars or people carriers. GM South Africa saw this vision and decided to use it as a North Star when designing their Land Rover Beta. The design started with an ultra basic ladder frame chassis. This design may be heavy, but it limits the chassis' ability to twist, making it super strong and effective in an off-road setting. Its wheelbase was also about 6 inches shorter than the Land Rover, meaning that it was nimble, sort of like a Suzuki Jimny. They then added a body which can only be described as the designer only had access to a ruler. Every single body panel fit together at a 90-degree angle and made the Defender look like a flowing E-Type Jag. They did this to maximize simplicity and steer clear of any complex moldings or body panels that they had to produce, keeping things cheap. This unique design earned this project the name the Pug, and that's quite convenient because this car was a mutt. It inherited so many different components from so many different cars from across the General Motors lineup. Despite the fact that 88% of this car's mass was local, GM South Africa sourced everything from dials to the gearbox from Opel in Germany, Holden in Australia, and GM America. The 88% local appeased the gnats, and the enormous sum of small borrowed parts meant that the car saved enormous sums of development money. This design may have been ugly as hell, but it also had almost non-existent overhangs. This meant that it was great for clambering over rocks and sliding down mountains. It was also a super versatile design. It had a normal single cab bed layout like a bakkie, but you could install benches in the back to turn it into a people carrier. The car also exclusively came as a convertible, and you could either option a soft top or a fiberglass hard top. Despite the fact that this car had a ladder frame chassis, it also was so basic and utilitarian that it only ended up tipping the scales a little bit over 1,000 kilograms, which is insanely light considering what this car was. This meant that the car didn't need crazy power, and in another attempt to save money, they sourced the 2.5-litre petrol engine from the Chevy 2500 sedan, but tweaked the manifolds to prioritize pull, meaning the car ended up only having about 76 kilowatts, but 193 Newton meters of torque. This was paired with a 4-speed manual gearbox with no low range, but had a very short first gear to help with low-speed off-roading situations. This car was shaping up to be a pretty incredible overland traveler, and as a result, they christened this car the Chevrolet Nomad. So based on these facts, you could assume that this was a pretty impressive Land Rover Challenger, especially when you compare them apples to apples. In comparison with the Series 3 2.25 litre Land Rover, the GM had more power, way more torque, 300 kilograms lighter, and also had a higher top speed. It was rugged and capable off-road and cheap to maintain because it relied heavily on parts that were already available. This should have left Land Rover quaking in their boots, right? Well, GM managed to mess up some very, very key decisions. Firstly, and most importantly, this car was rear-wheel drive. Yes, this 4x4 did not have 4x4 in the same way that the Land Rover did. This could have been because of perception, because at the time there was this idea that 4-wheel drive was for people who didn't know how to drive and rear-wheel drive was enough for off-roading. But the reality of the situation is it's probably because it was more expensive to use 4-wheel drive. The car did come with a limited slip differential, which helped the car keep traction in off-road situations, but it was really just a plaster on a pretty gaping wound. Then we need to talk about suspension, because the Land Rover had 2 solid axles, meaning it could bounce off any bump or boulder that you managed to crash into and handle the car's weight. The Nomad had independent front suspension that it inherited from the Chevy 1900 sedan, meaning it was perfectly fine on normal highways and tarred roads, but it regularly broke in off-roading situations, i.e., the place where it was designed to exist. The failures were so bad that Chevrolet had to fundamentally redesign the front suspension just 2 years after the car was released. And those were just the fundamental issues. The Land Rover was not exactly a Rolls Royce, but it did come with incredible creature comforts like effective insulation, a heating vent, and good weather sealing. The Nomad did not come with effective insulation, a heating vent, or good weather sealing. This meant that the car was incredibly loud and rattly, especially at high speed. It was also incredibly hot during the summer and freezing cold in the winter. This thing was supposed to be a hardcore utilitarian off-roader, but this was taking discomfort a little bit too far. These issues eventually got through to the buying public, and despite the fact that the initial sales were really good, the car only lasted from 1976 until 1980 with a total of 2,400 units sold. And with that, the dream of Chevrolet's Land Rover Beta died. Now, looking at this story, I think it would be incredibly easy to just go, oh, this car was just a failure. It was a flawed design from the beginning and it was never going to work. But I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I still think that the original concept was a great idea. Some of the best off-roaders that have endured decades and decades and multiple iterations were hardcore, no-nonsense utilitarian 4x4s. And I still think the idea of an ultra-lightweight, short wheelbase off-roader is really compelling. I mean, the internet is filled with videos of little Jimneys embarrassing larger, fully fledged off-roaders. I think where the Chevy Nomad failed was it cut corners in the wrong places. If you're creating a go anywhere, do anything off-roader, you can't skimp out on the 4-wheel drive, strong suspension, and the ability to keep your blood circulating below 10 degrees Celsius. Despite the fact that this car was objectively a failure, there is still this hardcore group of people who love and respect this thing. And to be honest, I kind of get it. Yes, it's ugly. Yes, it's not very good at off-roading. And yes, it is about as refined as a coal mine. But I still desperately want to drive one. Every middle-aged outdoorsy person nowadays has an old Defender or a Land Cruiser. They can all do the same thing and they all cost R500,000. To have something actually unique and actually interesting is such a rare thing to come across nowadays, which is why I think the Chevy Nomad is so endearing. So when we're looking back, scanning over the pantheon of incredible cars that South Africa has produced, I think we need to put some respect on South Africa's ugly duckling, the complete failure that absolutely won our hearts, the Chevy Nomad.